So today's presentation focuses on phrasal verbs, English phrasal verbs. I am a non-native speaker that have been teaching English for many years, and I've noticed that students struggle and find phrasal verbs very challenging. Myself as a teacher, sometimes I find teaching phrasal verbs very challenging as well. So I decided for my PhD to investigate further the English phrasal verb, which will be the main focus of today's presentations. So just an overview. First of all, I will explain a little bit the background and what inspired this study. Then I will move on to the specific research questions and the methodology followed, and we will discuss the results and some conclusion and pedagogical implications. So phrasal verbs are very frequent in the English language, and this is one of the main reasons why they are so important for learners to learn. A study by Garner and Davis actually estimated that a learner will encounter one phrasal verb in every 150 words of English to which they will be exposed. Adding to that, not only are they frequent, phrasal verbs are polysemous, so they have more than one meaning sense, which means that sometimes in order to be able to convey a specific meaning in English, they will need to use the phrasal verb rather than the one word equivalent verb. Gardner and Davis again estimated that on average, a phrasal verb has 5.6 meaning senses. Taking this into consideration, we can see that phrasal verbs are crucial to fluent English speech and to sounding native-like. However, as I said in the beginning, they are very challenging for learners. And in fact, past research has observed an avoidance phenomenon. What happens is that instead of using the phrasal verb, they prefer to use a single word verb. Now, what inspired me to carry out this research? After looking at the literature, I realized that a very small number of studies investigated learners' knowledge of phrasal verbs, while an even smaller number investigated learners' knowledge of the different phrasal verb meanings. So a small number of studies looked at polysemy, which is a very important factor in phrasal verb knowledge. The above studies concluded that frequency, as indicated by native speakers' corpus data, is a significant predictor of phrasal verb knowledge. So the more frequent a phrasal verb is in a native speaker's language, the more probable it is for the phrasal verb to be known by learners of English. However, it is an important point to mention here is that a word frequent in one context, as in a native speaker's corpora, does not necessarily translate in frequency in an EFL context, which is basically the input that learners receive in the classroom. In fact, research on textbooks, on English language teaching textbooks, which is the main, let's say, input they get the main input from their textbooks, has found that writers tend not to select items based on native speakers' corpora frequency, but rather on intuitions or on themes, because they tend to structure the textbook into various themes. So therefore, this study aims to look at two things. First of all, to measure second language learners' receptive and productive knowledge of frequent phrasal verbs and their most frequent meaning senses, but also to identify the best predictors of phrasal verb knowledge. And I looked at corpus frequency, textbook frequency, time spent in leisure activities in English, and time spent in an L2 country. What is important is that for this study, I looked at frequency not only based on native speakers' corpus indication, but also on textbook frequency counts. Of course, it's very difficult at this point, have to mention, to know the exact input that learners receive in the classroom. However, I think we can all agree that a textbook is the one commonly used in an English classroom, and the teachers sometimes tend to structure the lesson around the items of the textbook. And this study has two main research questions. The first one is, how good is second language learners' knowledge of phrasal verbs and their most frequent meanings? And what factors can we identify as the best predictors of phrasal verb knowledge? Now, the methodology. It was initially very difficult to kind of choose the participants. So I decided to focus the study in the Greek Cypriot context because it was, first of all, easy to find participants and to control their input, to control what items are included in the textbooks. So 100 participants, Greek Cypriot learners of English, were recruited, took part in the study from 4 private schools in Cyprus between the ages of 14 and 15. At the time of the study, participants had just completed the B1 plus Common European Framework of Reference for Language level. They passed their exams and they moved on into the B2 level. To collect the results, participants had to complete 3 tests. As I mentioned before, I wanted to measure both their receptive and their productive knowledge. So participants had to complete a phone recall, a phone recognition, and a meaning recognition test. They've also completed a biodata questionnaire, while 20 participants also took part in an interview in order to validate the test items, because 2 of the tests, as you will see later on, there are multiple choice tests, and there is also the fear of guessing. So kind of to minimize this, I decided to validate the test items with the use of interviews. Now, how did I select which items to be included in the test? As I mentioned before, one of the main reasons for carrying out this study was to measure learners' knowledge of polysemous phrasal verbs. So not only the actual phrasal verb, but also the various meanings of the phrasal verb. So to do that, I first use the fave list. The fave list is a phrasal verb list devised by Garnier and Smith. It's a very recent one where they basically identified the most frequent meaning senses of the 150 most frequent phrasal verbs in the COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English, that were previously identified by Liu, which he carried out a corpus study to identify the most frequent phrasal verbs in both COCA and the British National Corpus. Taking this, I kind of combined this knowledge about these frequent meaning senses and the frequent phrasal verbs with the findings from a previous study I've carried out, where basically I examined the phrasal verbs and the phrasal verb meaning senses in 6 textbooks, ranging from the B1 to the B2 level. So what I did was I identified the most frequent meaning senses and three phrasal verbs in these textbooks. So taking these two together, the test items included in the test were items that were shared between the 2 textbooks that the participants used in their classroom at the B1 plus level. It is very important to mention here that as I was carrying out the textbook investigation, of course, other meaning senses were identified in the textbooks, not included in the frequency list by Garnier and Smith. In order to be able to identify the frequency of these meanings in the COCA, I also carried out an additional corpus search to identify the additional frequency of these items. So in the end, items, as I said, were included from both the faith and there was the frequency list devised by Garnier and Smith and shared by the 2 textbooks that my 100 participants were using at the time of the research. It is important to mention that participants had passed the exam, so I was sure that they were all approximately at the same level. So they just passed B1 plus level and entered the B2. And after extensive pilot tests, 25 phrasal verbs, and a total of 72 meaning senses were selected and included in the 3 tests. These are the 2 textbooks examined, is the Cosmic B1 Plus and the Real English B1 Plus. And what is interesting about these textbooks, this series actually, is that these are the most popular series used in Cyprus at the moment, which means that we kind of ensure that a big number of learners are exposed to these phrasal verbs. And I just provided an example of the 3 tests. The first one is a productive test. The productive test is a form recall test in the form of a fill in the blank. So learners were given a sentence. In the parentheses, I included either a synonym or a definition. And I've also provided the first letter of the lexical verb and the first letter of the particle in order to restrict the options. And I've also given them to receptive test, which is a form recognition and a meaning recognition. Both there were multiple choice tests. In the form recognition test, students had to choose the correct form of a phrasal verb, while in the meaning recognition, they were giving the phrasal verb and they had to choose the correct meaning. Now, the results. It's important before I explain the results to remind you all that students were exposed to these phrasal verbs and they were exposed to these meaning senses because all the items chosen were shared by both textbooks. So one would assume that they would score high in this test, especially since they've passed the Cambridge examination. However, descriptive statistics were slightly disappointing. I've used the generalized linear model test to analyze the results. And what I've seen is that, as expected, they scored the lowest at the form recall test because it was the most difficult. They actually had to produce the test, and they score quite high compared to the form recall in the meaning recognition, the multiple choice test. However, if we look at the mean for the form recall test, they score 41.40%, which is very low. And one student had actually scored 8 out of the 72, which is very low. Slightly higher in the form recognition test. And as I said, the meaning recognition, they scored the highest. But bear in mind, if I take you back to the meaning recognition test, it was quite easy to identify the meaning because they had the phrasal verb and the choices below. So one would have assumed that they would score quite high in the meaning recognition, which is not the case. As you can see here, the graph. So therefore, it is quite disappointing to see that clearly students do struggle with phrasal verbs, and that we as teachers, we need to find ways to help them learn phrasal verbs. So in order to kind of see what factors affect phrasal verb knowledge, and this knowledge will help us improve the way we teach them and present them, the second research question is focused on which factors can be identified as the best predictors of phrasal verb knowledge. So the factors were, to remind you, frequency in the corpus, in this case, in the corpus of contemporary American English, frequency in the textbooks, minutes spent reading English books and watching English films, hours spent on social media, minutes spent listening to English songs, and time spent in an English-speaking country. I've also looked at the frequency of the various meaning senses in the corpus of native speakers, in the COCA, and the sense frequency in the textbook. Because at this point, it's important to mention that the first most frequent meaning in the COCA, which is in the native speaker's input, in fact, was found to be the fourth, just to give you an example, in the textbooks. So there were different frequency indication between textbooks and corpus. So the form recall test revealed that COCA frequency, so frequency of phrasal verbs in the native speaker's corpus, is a significant predictor, as well as textbook frequency. Interestingly, however, when I looked at the individual meaning senses, the frequency of the meaning senses in the corpus, in the native speaker's corpus, was not a significant predictor, while the frequency of the meanings in the textbooks, which is the actual input that students receive, was found to be a significant predictor. Additionally, watching films and reading English books were found to be significant predictors of knowledge. In other words, watching English films and reading books help learners to learn phrasal verbs. Now, these are the tests. I will not go over it again, but just in a nutshell, what we found was that both textbook frequency and corpus frequency are important, significant predictors. The frequency in the COCA of the various meaning senses were not found to have any significant effect on knowledge, while the frequency in the textbook has. And watching films and reading books does in fact help phrasal verb knowledge in a form recall level. Essentially, in the form recognition test, the same picture was revealed. So again, frequency in the COCA, in the native speakers corpora, was found to be a significant predictor of knowledge, as well as frequency in the textbooks and frequency of the meaning senses in the textbooks. Again, meaning spent reading, so reading books and watching films has been found to help phrasal verb knowledge to be a significant predictor of knowledge at the form recognition level. Interestingly here, time spent in an English-speaking country was found to be a predictor of knowledge. So maybe when learners spend time in an English, in a country where English is spoken, they could pick up the form of a phrasal verb, but because they haven't actually been taught the form, they're not able to produce it. In the meaning recognition test, again, essentially is the same picture, because we have the COCA frequency and the textbook frequency to be significant predictors, as well as the frequency of the meaning senses in the textbooks. Again, watching films and reading books does predict knowledge. Here, however, with quite a low world statistics, spending time on social media has been found to help learners phrasal verb knowledge. So this study, the conclusion of this study is that, and this is very important to be highlighted, we do need to spend time teaching phrasal verbs. This is a very difficult word construction of the English language, and actually students struggle with it. And it's important now to look at the factors. So we've looked that there is a positive relationship between corpus and textbook frequency. Now, as I mentioned before, studies have shown that textbooks don't actually choose items based off native speakers' corpus frequency. So maybe this study highlights the importance for textbook designers to consult native speakers' corpus findings when it comes to choosing what items to include in a textbook. Time spent reading and time spent watching films also have been found to be significant predictor of knowledge, which again, this translates to the need for teachers to basically include films in their classroom, in their lessons, or to advise students to read in a foreign language. For example, graded readers can be a part of the lesson. Now, time spent in an English-speaking country has been found to have a positive effect only at the form recognition level, which means that actually for learners to be able to benefit from living in a foreign country, they might need to stay in that country for longer than a month, which was the average of our participants, in order to be able to grasp full knowledge of a phrasal verb, while time spent on social media only has been found to be a significant predictor at a meaning recognition. Bear in mind, in Cyprus and Greece, they use what is known as Greek English. So they basically write with English characters in Greek, and a lot of the input they receive is in Greek. So maybe that's why social media hasn't been found to be significant predictor of knowledge. But what we can do in a foreign classroom is we can actually have collaboration with schools in foreign countries so students can talk to each other and exchange knowledge. This may possibly help. Thank you very much.
All right, we have 5 minutes for Q&A if any of you have any questions.
I have a question. May I ask?
Yes.
Yes.
Of course.
First of all, thank you very much for your awesome presentation. I'm a big fan of teaching vocabulary here in Japan and higher education. I just wish most of my colleagues felt the same way. I really like what you said about phrasal verb usage. And yeah, it does give more of a native feel when it's spoken. which is a hard sell here in Japan because most students don't learn English for communicative intent. It's not a broad statement. It's really true across the board. Rather, English is used to pass exams for certification, which in turn leads to a better job. And that doesn't really need English. The point I'm trying to make is, and trying to lead to, is I'm curious to know, do you consider the language environment in which your students are learning English to be a second language or foreign language environment? Like, is English considered a second language or foreign language?
No, in Cyprus, it's considered, first of all, it's a very important point because there's a difference between a second language and a foreign language. So in Cyprus, it's a foreign language. So of course, the input they receive outside the classroom is limited compared to a second, where English is a second language. And this plays a role.
It makes a big difference because they don't, in a second language environment, they have this support. So I could see why you're proposing the idea of getting your students to communicate with other speakers of English in other countries. I could see that need. We have the same need here.
And that's why when I chose to investigate input in textbooks, I felt quite sure that this is indeed the main input they receive, along with the input in the movies and in the books, because unfortunately, most of the students, when they leave the classroom, they will not speak English. They will continue speaking Greek.
We have the same issue here. In fact, I'm anathema to using second language, commercial second language texts in a Japanese environment, because those texts are designed for a second language learning environment. Whereas what we need here in Japan are books designed for a foreign language learning experience, and it requires a completely different pedagogy, not to mention materials like textbooks. I'm curious to know that I'm a big fan of COCA as well, Corpus of
yes.
What was it? Corpus of
Corpus of Contemporary American English.
Contemporary American English, and I've used it. I'm not much of a pro, but I know that it's a mixture of spoken and literary usage of English.
Exactly.
And so you're generating these frequency lists based on, I guess my question is, are you setting the parameter for only spoken or generative use?
No, I decided to look at all the various genres in the COCA just to get the full picture rather than focus only on spoken English.
So my last big question is as a language learner myself, Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese, Italian, French, English, vocabulary and the way you study it is a big deal, especially if you want to use the language, right? Do you have any tips for generative use of vocabulary?
Well, that's a very good question. There are various ways to teach vocabularies. The thing is, and this is one factor that we do need to consider, is that when this teacher is not a native speaker of English, sometimes there is the risk of simply providing the translation of a specific word in the native language. Now, I completely understand that teachers that do that. When I started out, I've done that. I'm not going to hide behind my finger. Sometimes it was easier, but this, in my opinion, it is a mistake. So the best way to learn vocabulary is to actively use the language. So you do need, first of all, it goes without saying that the lesson should be done only in English, and various activities need to be included in the classroom. As you've seen, the study found that watching films and listening to music and reading books is a significant predictor of knowledge, phrasal verb knowledge. But it's not just phrasal verb knowledge. Other studies have found that extensive reading has actually improved vocabulary knowledge. So what I suggest, and I actually try to also do in the classroom, is I use graded readers. Every student gets to choose the one they like. And once a month, because let's face it, I think we're all teachers here. There is the time constraints and students have to pass an exam. So sometimes we kind of need to bridge everything together. Once a month, they make a presentation. I like to use drama as well. So we choose a play and they act it out. And in fact, I have found the student not only increase their vocabulary, but they actually had fun.
Yeah. You know, you bring up a good point. Is I've actually used comic strips because this is the land of manga, right? Anime and manga.
Yes.
So I have them. I like the reading aspect, but also creating scenarios using a software where they actually take pictures of themselves and they put little captions over it and they write it in English. And maybe the task could be, you know, throw in 1 or 2 phrasal verbs, or here's a list of phrasal verbs, make a scenario, use one of these in there. It has
very nice.
Yeah, it has a high impact on the students, and then they present that to the class, right? Here's our strip and this kind of thing.
And they learn vocabulary without actually realizing it,
Yeah.
because let's face it, it's very boring if we just give them lists and then you tell them learn them and come back. Yes, they probably memorize it, but will they use it?
Yeah.
Yes, I might.
Thank
yes,
you.
David.
Yeah, thank you for answering my questions. Sorry for hogging the time.
Yes. Sorry, we can hear you.
I'm sorry, but have you or do you plan to share your results with the teachers of those 100 students to show them that what they've been teaching has not been learned, and to show them what are your suggestions for them to learn?
I have done that, and I've actually interviewed the teachers because it's very important to gain insight in their opinion about phrasal verbs. And what is interesting is that, because I use both native speakers and non-native speakers, experienced and non-experienced teachers in another study that I'm currently writing. The interesting thing is that because in the Cambridge vocabulary list, they only had a specific number of phrasal verbs that students had to know in order to pass the exam, what happens is the non-native, less experienced teachers tend to focus on that list so the students would pass the exams and get a good mark, rather than actually really paying attention on what is included in the textbook, which I completely get it because I've been there and it comes with effort. And as I said, phrasal verbs are challenging, not just for students, but I think for us as well as teachers to teach them.
All right, I think that's all our time that we have for Q&A. If you guys can, please give a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you.
And
Alanita.
please